Hello. Welcome back to Dr. Han's history class. Last time I set the stage by talking about agriculture. In the 8th century, Europeans adopted an agricultural system using three-field rotation and the heavy plow, which created extra food, an agricultural surplus. Extra food, specialization of work, so not everybody had to work making their own food. This is the basis of the specialization of human function and of social economic growth. I'm now going to use that little snippet of global agricultural history as a jumping off point to explain why Christopher Columbus set sail for America in 1492. It has to do with the system of worldwide trade that existed before Columbus, and that his patron, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain, tried to disrupt. Because agricultural surplus created a demand for spices, to cure and preserve food, preserve it from rotting, and make it taste better, of course. Here are some images from my spice catalog. Here's vanilla, the beans whose sticky insides make vanilla flavoring. And here are peppercorns, because pepper was definitely the spice of the day. And here, both black peppercorns and ground pepper, ready for cooking or for the table. The problem, of course, is that most spices don't grow in warm climates. They don't grow in Northern Europe. Pepper came from Asia, primarily. Let's have a look at our map of human spread and settlement and see how Asia and Europe connect over land. The round coast is China, and this tooth down here is India, sticking down into the Indian Ocean. This is the east coast of Africa, and this bit here is known as the Horn of Africa. Then up into the Red Sea and into the Mediterranean, into Europe. This isn't going to be on the test. I'm just trying to orient you to world history and the locations that matter to understand the context for Columbus. Because even before Columbus, goods moved from Asia to Europe. There were overland routes known as the Silk Road, marked here in green, and caravans could carry goods across Asia and through Constantinople and down to the Mediterranean Sea. Here, again, you see rounded China, the triangle tooth of India, and the Red Sea, up through the Middle East, into the Mediterranean, into Europe. The Silk Road carried silk cloth and also spices from Asia, from the Spice Islands, into Europe. The Silk Road linked European consumers with Asian goods through the region that today we call the Middle East. Here, on the eastern edge of the Mediterranean, where Israel and Palestine sit, we see the goods from Asia ended up. Let's switch maps now to Europe and the Mediterranean. And here is the Middle East. In those days, it was called the Levant. You can see the word here on the outline. The Levant means the East, and the trade that passed through the Middle East was known as the Levantine trade. The Levantine trade connected the goods of Asia with the medieval European markets. This is an important point. Goods from Asia reached medieval Europe through the Middle East, through the Levant, through the Levantine trade. In fact, it's possible to see the European Crusades as a response to this commercial structure, the Silk Road and the Levantine trade. Keep your eye on the Middle East here, the Levant, on Damascus and Jerusalem, and here, a close-up of the same area with Damascus and Jerusalem, showing the European settlement of the Levant as part of the wars that historians call the Crusades. Now, the Crusades were actually a series of religious wars. In 1096, 1147, 1187, and 1204, just a few hundred years after the medieval Europeans adopted heavy plow agriculture, they set off to try to regain the Holy Land from Muslims. They wanted places like Jerusalem to be under European, Christian control, so they set off on crusades. European crusaders sought to regain the Holy Land for Christianity, and some settled down there. This map of crusader settlements show the places where European crusaders established a foothold in the Levant and got control of some of the trade in spices and fabrics, silks and cottons, imported over the Silk Road from Asia. And this introduces one of the main themes of the course, the tension between ideals and economics. In the European Crusades, we see the ideal of Christianity effected or made possible, the economic goal of controlling the flow of goods from Asia to Europe. We'll see this theme develop throughout the course. Here, in European expansion leading to Columbus' discovery, we'll feel again the tension between ideals and economics during the formation of the nation in the late 1700s and in the writing and passage of the Constitution. We'll feel that conflict between ideals and economics again in the coming of the Civil War and the nation-state formation of both Confederacy and in the United States response. For now, though, we can feel that there's a conflict in the geographical expansion of medieval Europe into the Middle East, because the Crusaders' goals were religious, but the effect was commercial. Let's return to the big picture. After the Crusades, most of this trade from the Levant, from the Mediterranean and into Europe, was controlled through Venice, the Italian city-state. Venice here, and also Genoa, on the other side of Italy's boot, here. This map shows how goods reached Europe from Asia, and now, look at the intricate routes around and across the Mediterranean that Venice and Genoa used to distribute the goods of the Levantine trade. Here's a picture I took a couple of years ago in Venice. On the side of one of the palazzi, there's this bas-relief, this sculpture on the wall of, can you see what it is? It's a camel. Goods probably came here, to this house of this merchant of Venice from Asia through the Levant, and ships sailed into the house here, entering from the canal with this Asian cargo, silks and spices, for sale to the rest of Europe. So let's return to this map of trade routes before Columbus, which shows the world as it was understood before Columbus landed in the Americas. It shows the trade moving goods from Asia through the Levant into the Mediterranean. It also shows how Columbus could imagine that if he set sail from the Mediterranean out in the other direction, out into the Atlantic, he'd end up in Asia, here in the Spice Islands. So, here we are, at the midpoint of the outline. Let me summarize. Medieval Europe was enmeshed in a complicated system of world trade that carried goods over the Silk Road from Asia to the Middle East, known as the Levant. After the Crusades, Venice especially, and also Genoa, Italian city-states, controlled the sale of these goods across Europe. That's an impressive world system. Venice couldn't last. Its control over world trade just couldn't last. The rulers of Spain and Portugal began to be jealous and want some of this wealth and trade for themselves. I mean, look at this map. With this coastline, Spain and Portugal had to be serviced over land. Look at how the Iberian Peninsula, with Spain and Portugal on it, could dominate the sea. Here, Iberia, Spain and Portugal. Big players in American history to 1877. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella financed Columbus's voyage because they were trying to find a way to undercut Italy's dominance of world trade. They wanted to take some of the commerce from Venice and Genoa, take it for themselves. The Portuguese were the first movers in attempts to find new ways to trade, ways around Venetian control. As you can see, Spain and Portugal are both within spitting distance of Africa. You can practically see Africa from parts of the Portuguese coast. That's how close they are together. They are separated by the Straits of Gibraltar, which separate the Mediterranean Sea from the Atlantic Ocean. Now, this slide sketches the currents of the world's oceans. And if you look at the Atlantic, you can see that the current would carry ships and sailors from Portugal right down the coast of Africa. So wherever they set sail, that's where they headed. But when they tried to land there, they didn't find much that was useful. That's the Sahara Desert, after all. And moreover, while the prevailing winds and currents let them sail easily down the coast of Africa, it was hard to turn around and get back. The forces of nature that sped them on their way prevented them from returning home. At some point, though, they began to realize. Scholars date this from the 13th century, the 1200s, just at the end of the Crusades. The Portuguese began to realize that if they caught those currents out, instead of turning around, they could find a way home. Rather than beat against the wind and the current, they headed out into the Atlantic to head back home. This is what historians call the volta, a word for a circuit. And as the Portuguese completed the volta in the 1200s, they had found a key to exploration. They could sail down the coast of Africa, pick up a current into the Atlantic, and then head home from there. They could go further and further, knowing they could get home. For this reason, the volta is an important moment on the path to Columbus's voyage that connected Europe, Africa, and the Americas into a new world system after the Crusades. In order to go further, the Portuguese sailors began to land on the Canary Islands as a midpoint, a place to stop and stock up for further explorations. These are the Canary Islands, here on the west coast of Africa, and the Portuguese would land there and collect some fresh water for the rest of the voyage, and food. Where'd they get the food? They established farms there, and I'm condensing a lot of history here. Eventually they began to grow on those farms not food, but sugar. They grew sugar as a commodity and turned it into liquor and sugary treats that they were able to sell. Here, on these itty-bitty islands in the middle of the sea, off the west coast of northern Africa, they began a system of agricultural production in which large-scale farms produced commodities, interchangeable agricultural goods, for sale on the world market. It's not clear when they shifted from food to sugar, but they did. Sugar, a commodity for world markets, to finance rather than feed their voyages of exploration. Sometime between 1204 and the end of the Crusades, at some point before 1492 and Columbus' voyage, in those 3 centuries, they established the plantation mode of production. Large-scale plantations to grow commodities for trade. The Portuguese came up with it. To work the farms, they enslaved the natives, the Guanche tribes of the Canary Islands. The Guanches fought valiantly, but became the first victims of European expansion and Columbian exchange. They fell to disease and forced labor within a century. Sometime in the 1400s, archaeologists estimated, the Canary Islands had been depopulated. All the residents had died. By then, however, the Portuguese had found new populations to labor on the plantations. They had completed the volta, which carried them down the coast of Africa, where they encountered these tribes, these densely populated regions below the Saharan desert, people who lived on rice. These rice-fed, irrigation-based tribes would eventually populate the Americas as slaves, and the plantation system of agriculture, using forced labor from distant locations, lay ready to adapt in the New World. You can see it's from the Canary Islands that they were sailing out into the sea, into what became the age of explorations and of European expansion into the Americas. So this is the context for the voyages of Columbus. He was a native of Genoa in Italy, an heir and native son, the recipient of all this world commerce power. His voyage of exploration was financed by Spain, and he represented the Spanish crown's desire to find another route to the riches of Asia, to undercut the Italians in their dominance of the Levantine trade, another way around the world. and the wealth of sugar financed these explorations. This is why he thought he was in India. That's where he had sailed. But of course, Columbus hit the Americas instead, establishing contact with a territory unknown to Europeans. Across the seams of the world, people, goods, and ideas began to move, establishing what scholars call the Columbian Exchange. It's named Columbian for Columbus, and the exchange stands for the movement of goods in both directions. Precious metals and new plants from the Americas, potatoes, tomatoes, tobacco, all of these are New World plants. Italian cooking, as we know it today, with tomato sauce, that's a product of the Columbian Exchange, because the tomatoes came from the Americas and influenced Italian cuisine. Europeans carried diseases unknown in the New World and killed a lot of natives who never even saw the Europeans. Syphilis, on the other hand, came from the New World, and the first sailors carried it back into the heart of Europe. These are all examples of the Columbian Exchange. In upcoming lectures, we'll begin to examine how this free-ranging exchange began to settle down into a regular pattern, what you probably learned in school to call the triangle trade, which crisscrossed the Atlantic and linked Europe, Africa, and the Americas into a New World system. But first, we'll see how the many European powers competed with each other for the riches of the Americas. That's where I'll pick up next time.